What? So, Mom,
Hello everyone, and welcome to the first of the two global events to mark International Day of People with Disabilities. I am Aki Takada, a member of Baker McKenzie Global ID and E Committee. International Day of People with Disabilities is December 3rd and was proclaimed by the United Nations in 1992 to promote an understanding of disability issues and mobilize support for the dignity, rights, and well-being of persons with disabilities. In 2022, the 30th anniversary of that proclamation, the overarching theme is focused on innovation and transformative solutions for inclusive development. In other words, looking at technology and other innovative solutions to increase accessibility and opportunities for people with disabilities. To discuss these and other issues, we are very pleased to welcome Missen Desiderio Dim from Accenture and Ruel Ramirez from Shell, both of whom have had extensive involvement in inclusion and diversity generally, and in the area with disability in particular, either through personal or professional experience. Thank you both for joining us today. We are very appreciative of your participation in today's event. I will now hand over to our moderator, Matthew Jones, to commence our panel discussion. Matthew, please.
Thank you, Aki. On behalf of Baker McKenzie and the Global ID and E team, welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining today's virtual event for International Day of People with Disabilities. As Aki has mentioned, this event is the first of two global events we are running to mark the day, and you are, of course, welcome to join both if the time zones work for you. My name is Matthew Jones, Senior Manager for ID and E in Asia Pacific, and I'm very pleased to be joined by our special guest today, Missen Desiderio Dime, Director for Legal Compliance and Regulatory Operations at Accenture, and Ruel Ramirez, Global Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Excellence Advisor from Shell. Welcome to both of you, and thank you for making the time to join our event today.
Thank you very much for having me, and I'm so glad to be here. It's actually my first speaking engagement after my first chemotherapy. And as I told you before, I am now officially a person with double disability, having both a visual disability and having been diagnosed with cancer a few weeks ago. So today is very special to me personally, as an IND advocate and as a person with disability myself. So thank you for having me today.
Thank you. Thank you, Ruel.
Thank you, Matthew.
So during this panel event, we will discuss how our organisations support people with disabilities, and we will also cover the following: what our organisations and others are doing well in this space, where there is room for improvement and things we could be doing, the specific challenges people with disabilities face in working environments, both office-based and remote, and how organisations can build the workplace of the future to improve accessibility and equity, particularly for people with disabilities. And before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. As you can see there, the session is being recorded and all webinar materials will be shared post-event. If you'd like to ask questions, you can use the Q&A and you can also use the chat function to send any comments or if you require access support. You can click the Show Captions button to access or hide the subtitles, and non-verbal reactions are available by clicking the arrow up beside the Reactions button to change your view. Finally, this event may also allow you to claim CLE credit, so please contact your L&L or TM team to check about that in your office. So without further ado, I'd now like to turn to our first guest, Ruel Ramirez, and ask him to tell us something about his own personal experience of disability or working with people with disabilities, and what organisational improvements he has been responsible for in his workplace. Ruel, over to you.
Thank you, Matthew. And before I share my experience, just want to do a best practice that that we do when we have engagements like this. Just a visual description of myself, so that those who may not be able to see me would know what I look like. So I'm Filipino. I'm Asian. I have black hair. I wear glasses. I'm wearing a gray shirt. And I'm happy to be here. Now to share my experience, my personal experience with disability, right? So, um, it's meaningful that this day is the 30th anniversary of International Day for Persons with Disability, because this is the same exact year that my father had been, you know, diagnosed with a disability himself, right? So my personal experience was that my father 30 years ago was going through a medical condition that rendered him paralyzed. So I was a teenager at the time. And as you can imagine, accessibility was not as advanced during that period. So just to give you a description, 30 years ago, we were living in a house that did not have any accessibility features. And we were staying, or at least the room that my dad was sleeping in was on the second floor. So, to make a long story short, I had to carry my father, up the stairs just for him to get to his room and back, up until the time that we were able to get a house that was not as inaccessible, meaning, one story, with more equipment. So yeah, so that has been, my early experience with disability. And more recently, I have family members who are military veterans of conflicts of wars, especially the recent one in the Middle East, and just recently, this family member of mine was diagnosed with PTSD and has had to go through adjustments and accommodations for him to deal with the disability. So this is a subject that's close to my heart. I myself was temporarily disabled last year, having gone through surgery, and I could not use my limbs at the time. So for a brief period for over a month last year, I somehow realized the challenges that persons with disability, from a firsthand perspective, go through on a daily basis. So this is something that I'm quite passionate about in doing something. Now, you ask, what have I personally done in the organization? Well, I'm one of the people in charge with diversity, equity, and inclusion in Shell. And my specific focus in our organization is on disability inclusion and enablement. And I currently lead our Global Enablement Coalition, right? So this is a collection of um, employee resource groups, functions, and businesses, along with our external partners, to really discuss, the topic in the organization and address issues from a global perspective. Right, so I'm quite proud of that achievement and that coalition, because we have done so many things in the last year or so, since we founded this, right? So I can share a bit more, in the next questions or so. But yeah, that's so far, I think, is one of the hallmarks of my role in Shell. Getting this wide and broad coalition together to really address challenges related to disability and enablement.
Great, thank you so much. Mishen, you've mentioned that you're a person with double disabilities, so you obviously have a lot of personal experience of this, but perhaps if you could enlarge on that and also give us a bit more information about what you have done at Accenture in this space.
So, well, I've actually been living with my disability since it was discovered when I was probably in the third grade. When my parents were wondering why my grades suddenly dropped um, at that age when I was doing quite well prior. And then my teacher realized that the reason why was because I could not see the blackboard. I was extremely myopic. But we never really thought of myopia as a disability because there are corrective there are corrective mechanisms for it. You wear glasses. But I think people don't realize when you're a little kid growing up in those days, you get a lot of bullying for having glasses, and they call you four eyes. But I never personally considered it as a disability until I got older, because then it became more difficult for me. I have had to have reattachment surgery for my retina because the pressure that the high grade my eyes have is always threatening to detach my retina. So I've had to have several laser treatments to reconnect that. Um, but like I said, since I've been living with the disability for so long, and I think that's the wonderful nature of people is that they adapt and learn. And while it's difficult, you you become resilient, and it just becomes a part of what makes you unique. And that's how I see people with disability, is that we're different, we're unique. That doesn't make us less. We're just as talented, we're just as driven, we have the same emotions, we have the same aspirations. We just might be a little different from you. And I'm very, very lucky to work for an organization like Accenture, where they not only um, accommodate disability, they celebrate diversity, and they find ways to make sure that um, everyone is given their chance to be as great as they can be, and the technology to allow them to achieve that. So globally, we have about over 8,000 self-declared persons with disabilities. um, I am proudly one of them. And I say that because there still are countries where having a disability is a stigma. And it can be a challenge to have people self declare as a person with disability. Um, Unfortunately, it's not my day job. Unlike Ruel is lucky because that is his day job. He gets to spend all his efforts making things better for PWD. I do it in on top of my regular job. I volunteer. I'm an IND. An ally for IND as well as the LGBT community. I participate where I can, and whatever little influence I have as a leader in my organization, I throw the weight of towards developing programs that will help persons with disabilities. So proudly, the Philippines was one of the first Accenture geographies that developed what we call the Accessibility Center. And I believe I sent some photos to Matt earlier.
Yes,
But
I'll just bring that up now.
yeah, we're super proud of this because we have this disability center in 7 countries. It's really not just an advice, it's an enablement and advisory space, we call it, because you go there and you tell them your specific needs, and they try to determine what technology we can provide you to make your life better. So we started with bone conducting headsets for people who were hearing impaired, because traditional headsets, um, because their senses are far more sensitive to certain pitches and sounds, and it made it physically painful to use traditional headsets. So we started experimenting with sound conducting through the bone conduction technology. And it just evolved from that first headset. And our infrastructure services lead, Rudy Gao, who I wish were here because he's really fantastic and he's done a wonderful job, created the center in Manila. And now it's being replicated across the globe. We have 7 different countries. In the Philippines alone, we have several because we have 21 facilities. And what we want to do is have a facility that's accessible. So in Cebu, where we have 5 offices, we make sure we have one facility there so everyone can go. And for people who are housebound, because they're physically unable to come to the office, we deliver the technology to them through this program as well. So it's a continual work in progress and something we're very proud of. Like, I remember my first experience with it was just going there and telling them, it's so hard for me to type because my keyboard is so tiny. And they gave me this fantastic, ginormous keyboard that looked like a Lego toy. I love it. It travels with me because the keys are so big, it's easier for me to type. But sometimes the solutions are that simple, right? And it just takes thoughtfulness and empathy and the sincere effort to understand what people are going through so that you can make life easier for them.
Thanks, Miss N. I might just turn back to Ruel now. We started touching on some of the problems or the issues that people with disabilities face in the workplace. And obviously some of them are obvious, physical accessibility, for example, and many organisations and countries have put in place measures to address that. But what are some of the other challenges that people with disabilities face and which perhaps aren't being addressed, and how can organisations address those issues to make the workplace more accessible and equitable?
Thanks, Matthew. That's an excellent question. Right, you touched upon accessibility, right? And what we don't realize about accessibility is beyond the built environment, there's also the digital component, right? So so a lot of organizations are still not compliant with digital accessibility, plus accessibility in other realms that are not fully explored yet, right? So as you can imagine, there are various different functions in most corporate environments that may not necessarily know or understand how to make their services, products, or offerings accessible. So accessibility, of course, is
perhaps
a
for
huge
those that,
challenge for
perhaps for those who
disability.
For those who don't know what digital accessibility is, could you perhaps just expand on what that encompasses?
Sure. So that is, to what extent, your websites or other digital, products, assets are accessible to all, especially those who have a disability, right? So that would mean, for example, making sure that you have the right contrast, you have the right font in place, the reading order, right? Sometimes it's as simple as, if you're using Microsoft, just, running an accessibility check and making sure you adjust certain things. Sometimes when you're in the design side, meaning when you design your website, you make sure that the design is accessible to as many people, if not all people, as possible, right? So that's digital accessibility, right? So this is often overlooked by companies, but it's now getting traction, at least in this day and age. So that's accessibility. The other piece is disability inclusion, right? Because accessibility is making all of your products, events, meetings, accessible as much as possible or usable. But disability inclusion involves behavior, right? And one of the challenges that that persons with disability often share with us, in our work is, them being treated differently or being othered, so to speak, right? And sometimes, it's not because, people who do not have a disability want to discriminate, but they're not, aware or educated about the issues that that persons with disability or challenges that they face. So, for example, if someone with a disability meets an accessibility accommodation, they might be provided that, but the way it's being delivered, right, might make the person feel that, that they're being treated differently, right? So we see that as being hand in hand when we support our colleagues with disability. You can't have without the other, right? Because, your environment might be accessible, but the way people are being treated, they might not feel included, or they don't have that sense of belonging, right? So that is the other challenge that needs to be addressed by organizations. Also, how do you make, your culture inclusive so that everybody has a sense of belonging?
That's right. It must be quite tricky for organisations, because obviously you want to make accommodation for people with disability, but not make it appear like it's special treatment. So getting that level right, I guess, is the challenge for a lot of organisations. Mission, you've obviously had first-hand experience of this. What has been your experience of that accommodation or special treatment, and how has Accenture, do you think Accenture has got the balance right?
I believe so, because we are always a fan of, we're such a big fan of design thinking as a process. I don't know if you're aware of the design thinking model, but it's really developing processes and services, but basing it on the perspective of the person that's going to be using the process. So it's client centric. So when we try to design new processes, for example, how do we enable our employees to do, let's say, self-service getting your equipment or registering for things? Part of the design thinking process involves someone that, what if the person that's using the service is disabled and has this type of disability? What challenges would they face that we didn't think about if we just purely designed this with a team that's composed of ordinarily abled persons, right? So I think it should start from the ground up, and that's what Accenture tries to do. So we try to design our processes and our tools the same way that we do data privacy by design. We also try to do accessibility by design. So from the beginning, it's already top of mind. Um, and we try to make the experience as seamless as possible. For example, there's not too many questions asked that makes you feel like, I mean, doesn't make it difficult if, let's say, I want a keyboard that has the Braille characters on it, or I want you to enable the function on my Microsoft Teams that reads the chat aloud for me, because I'm visually impaired and I cannot read the chat myself. So we do make it as business-like and as ordinary as we can, so that people don't feel like I'm being treated differently, or it's such a chore, or it's such an effort to do it. Because I think as a person with disability, that's what I don't like most. But to me, the challenge now is defining what disability is, because in the past, we've always thought of disability in the traditional sense, meaning we think about persons who are visually impaired or hearing impaired or mobility impaired. And that's basically the traditional concept of disability, even in the Philippines, for example. But things are developing differently now. To me, for example, someone who's suffering depression or anxiety, as an anxiety disorder, is just as debilitating as a physical disability. And the definition of disability now covers a range of conditions that would include depression and anxiety disorders, or the fear of going out in public, etc. And then there's, like in the Philippines, for example, because I'm a nerd, the first thing I did when I learned I had cancer was study. And I learned that they passed a law. I knew they had a law in 2018 declaring the cancer patients as covered by the Magna Carta for disabled persons in the Philippines. But I did not really study the law in depth until I became one of them. And it's very hopeful, because it shows you that the government itself is recognizing that disability goes far beyond the traditional concepts of mobility and vision and sound and vocalization. So I think that's the next frontier for us, is defining what else are disabilities and what else can we do to make the workplace and society in general inclusive for those people.
That's right. Ruel, do you want to comment on that aspect about perhaps the areas of disability that are non-visible or perhaps aren't considered to be traditional areas of disability, and perhaps how Shell is what Shell is doing to address that?
Sure. We have not necessarily defined what disability is, right? Because from country to country that might be different, right? But we tend to align with the social, model of disability, wherein, the social model is that it's the environment, not the person, who renders a person to be disabled. So, for example, I might have full use of my, my limbs, my faculties, etc. But if there's something in my workplace that will prevent me from doing something, then that will effectively disable me, rather than the medical model wherein, if you have a specific condition, then, then you can be considered, someone with a disability. But of course, each country has their own definition, and we respect that. So that being said, right, and Michelle is right. So there are non-visible disabilities or medical conditions that need to be addressed also. So, for example, she mentioned cancer. There is also cognitive disabilities, like, for example, dyslexia, right? So some people might have a learning disability, or even within the realm of neurodiversity, right? So certain parts of the spectrum are considered disability. For example, autism, right? So each of these conditions and experience of people might require them to have an adjustment or accommodation, whether in the built environment, digital, or whatever, right? So if there's something in the environment that prevents them to bring their full selves to work, or meaning perform effectively, then it's incumbent for the organization to provide the accommodation, so that person is no longer quote unquote disabled by said environment, right? So that was my thought on that.
Okay, thank you. That's really interesting to hear that. We've talked a lot about organizational approaches to disability, but I'd like to turn now to what individuals can do. And sometimes it may seem that it's a bit overwhelming if you don't have experience of... Sorry, Ms. Shin. That's great, thank you. We understand you've got responsibilities in the background, that's fine. But yes, turning to the individual now, and obviously this is should be the focus of any approach to disability inclusion. What can individuals themselves do in relation to disability inclusion? Often it seems like this is something that perhaps senior leaders or ID&E people are responsible for. But if I could turn back to Mission, what can individuals do? What would you like to see your colleagues doing in terms of disability inclusion?
I think, first of all, is educate themselves, because it's such a wide realm, and there's disabilities that are very apparent, and there are some that are not so apparent. And the only way that you can respond appropriately is if you know as much as you can about what you're facing. Because having that knowledge gives you empathy and understanding. And at the core of everything we do, I think there has to be empathy. Because if you're able to feel what they feel, or put yourselves in the shoes of someone that's suffering from disability, then you're better able to understand and help, right? Second is, I think for leaders especially, who have disabilities, to come out and declare themselves as having a disability, because there should be no stigma attached to having a disability. And by showing that despite your disability, or in spite of your disability, you've become a leader, you've become successful, you've been able to achieve certain things, it encourages younger people that have the same condition as you, and shows them that it doesn't have to stop you from doing what you need to do, or doing what you want to do. And if you don't have a disability yourself, become an ally. Learn and help, volunteer, sometimes it's just spending time with people. Showing up is important. And to me, that was the number one thing. I try to make it a point to volunteer for activities for our PWD community as much as I can, given my day job. But because it's, honestly, I always feel like I take back more than what I give because they're so inspiring. And I wish I could do more. But if we all go out there with that sense of, number one, learn as much as you can, get to know them as individuals beyond the disability. And if you're disabled, own it and be proud of it and be as successful as you can.
That's a great way to look at it. Thanks so much for those inspiring words. Ruel, perhaps I might turn back to you and ask you the same question, and perhaps also if you could consider the issue about people being afraid to ask questions, or perhaps feeling like they might offend people by asking the wrong questions. How can we address that?
Right. And I agree with Ms. N, right? The key there is educating ourselves and learning more about the topic, right? And that is a step towards becoming an ally, right? And you can really elevate that to become an active ally by speaking up and asking, questions about the topic of disability, because it's still a taboo, right? To talk about in certain communities, but the more we provide that psychological safety in our communities and environment, the more it can be discussed, so that real change can be achieved to make the workplace more equitable. It's everybody's responsibility, because UN estimate is that 15% of our global population is living with a disability, or or has someone in their family who has a disability. So that's a lot of people. We just reached 8 billion people just I think the other month, right? So if those estimates are are accurate and correct, that could mean that each and every one of us are either living with a disability, or taking care of someone or know someone who has a disability, right? So being an active ally is critical and important to make the world, society, and our workplace more inclusive and equitable. To your question about how do we address that challenge of people not feeling comfortable talking about this, I think it's all about promoting a learner mindset, right? I mean, initially I was not even comfortable talking about the same topic, right? Because it might not be something that people want to discuss. So I'll give you an example. There was a time that I was facilitating a workshop in an Asian country, and the moment I started to talk about the topic of disability, everybody started to touch wood, right? Because I said, why are you touching wood? Because when you talk about this, it's like you're inviting, that disability to come upon you. So there are still places in the world that has this belief, right? So in that sense, how do you address this? Of course, with more education, with more conversation, and treat it as a learning, a learning project, learning experience, or a learning objective. We have to accept the fact that we don't know everything about this topic. So it's always good for us to ask someone who might know more about it, a subject matter expert, someone with, someone, having that lived experience of having a disability. Be considerately curious about it, right? So I mean, you don't just go out and start asking questions deliberately, without thinking about what you're going to ask, but having that conscious way of being inclusive and asking people, politely and sincerely, how it is to be someone with living with disability. What is their experience with accessibility? I think that goes a long way. And the organization's responsibility is to really provide and cultivate that, that environment that promotes psychological safety and that learner's mindset amongst its organization. So that's what we do a lot in Shell, right? To make sure that topics like this can be openly discussed and have conversations about, so that we can arrive at at real solutions.
And how does Shell do that? I mean, what practical steps does the organization take to make those conversations easier to have?
I think it all links back to our strategy, right? Because in our powering progress strategy, this is our group strategy. Part of that is our powering lives ambition, right? And we have publicly stated that we aim to be one of the most diverse and inclusive organizations in the world, right? And part of that is providing a safe, caring, and inclusive environment for persons with disability. All of this was publicly committed to, right? So we've done a lot in terms of making sure that this is part of our organization's plans, right? So it also drives all the initiatives that we're doing within the disability inclusion and enablement space. And just to share, right? So in our organization, we have 4 focus areas in improving equity, right? So one is gender, gender balance. Then another one is race and ethnicity. The third is LGBT plus, and the fourth is disability inclusion and enablement. Right. So these are 4, you know, 4 focus areas that we have committed to improving, and this is consistently discussed, communicated, right? And we have real goals behind it. I mean, just this year we came out with our global enablement priorities, where countries and businesses can align their goals towards improving this space within their own jurisdiction or within their own context or space, right? So these are the things that we're doing, because the more you do these things, the more comfortable people are in talking about it. It normalizes the conversation, and so. Yeah.
That's great. That's really interesting to hear. Mission, what is Accenture doing in this space to make these sorts of conversations easy to have?
Well, similar to what Shell is doing, we've identified inclusion and diversity as a priority. In fact, Accenture has won awards for our efforts towards ensuring that we have an inclusive and diverse workplace. We have gender balance as well. In the Philippines, for example, in terms of gender balance, we're proud to say that the heads of our country managing director, our head of legal, our head of HR, our head of geographical services are all women. And this is a historical moment for us, where all the major functions in the corporate function setting are women. And our numbers for inclusion and diversity in terms of our PWD population increases every year. And we encourage people to have that, because as Roel mentioned, psychological safety is very important. So to us, it's not just about providing them the technology, but it's also providing them that psychological safety net. And so on top of what we provide in the Accessibility Center in terms of technology and equipment, we also enable our HR people to train in terms of how to talk to people, but we also have psychology professionals on staff and as part of our employee care programs that makes it accessible to anyone, actually, not just persons with disabilities, but anyone, to get psychological help if they need it and want it. And so it's really a holistic approach we want, because we do realize that the spectrum of disability is so broad. It's never going to be possible to find a one-size-fits-all solution or approach. So the best thing that you can do really is encourage everyone in the organization to learn about it as much as they can. and to provide mechanisms that give them the opportunities to learn.
And do you have specific affinity groups around disability, or do you look at including disability as part
Well, in the
of your
Philippines,
working
for example,
environment?
yeah. So we do encourage our departments to partner with, for example, during the summers, we have internship programs for students with disabilities to come and work for Accenture. And if they like us, maybe when they graduate, they'll come join us permanently. Um, we do advertise, we do advertise saying that, we would love for you to come work with us. If you're, don't let having a disability stop you, because um, we actually give ourselves an internal quota of how much we want to hire persons with disabilities and want to reach that target. And we want to increase that target annually so that the population grows as well.
That's
So
great.
we've been doing, and well, we do that with our suppliers as well, not just Accenture. For example, our vendors, we want to see their commitment to inclusion and diversity as well. So when we engage with new vendors, for example, law firms, we ask them about the balance of gender in their organization, and if what is their position with regard to supporting persons with disabilities. And we do that for all our vendors, because you got to pay it forward. And if your best practice is shared with the people you work with, maybe they'll do the same thing with the other people they work with also.
Yes, that's a very important point, and I can personally testify to having received some of those inquiries that it is important, because it then does encourage us to move in the right direction as well. So I think that's really important. Thank you for that. Just finally, I might ask Ruel, what more needs to be done? We've heard a lot of good stories about what is happening, and the positive things are happening in organizations, but presumably there's more that can be done. Where would you like to see things focused over the next little while to build that really inclusive workplace environment?
I think what more could be done in this space, right? I think we're just barely scratching the surface, right? I think the theme this year for ID PWD, from a UN standpoint, I think is technological innovation, right, for inclusion. So there's a lot more that could be done to really push the boundaries as to how do we make the world, society, communities, and our workplace more inclusive and more accessible to everyone. So in that sense, I think what we can do more of really is how do we have those conversations with colleagues and people that we know that might have a disability, so that we can learn more, so that we can bring those same learnings, so that they can be cross-pollinated across all the things that we do to make to make the world, society, communities, and workplace truly inclusive environment. Right? Because I always believe in that that saying, right? Nothing for us without us. So you hear that quite a lot in engagements like this about disability, because one thing that we tend to leave out of the picture is having that necessary representation of persons with disability in everything that we do, right? So in that sense, how do we make sure that this segment of our population is truly represented? And I think we can do more. And I'm speaking for us in general, everybody, because if we can be truly inclusive, meaning everything that we do is really accessible and inclusive of everyone, then there is no need for for conversations like this in the future. I think when we get to that point, then I think we've done quite a bit in progress, but there's still a lot of work to be done, right? And it always starts with having those honest conversations with those who are living that experience.
Starts with individual, yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ruel. Mission, your thoughts on this? What more can we do, and where to next?
Well, to me, it's always been, I think when I think about what more I need to do and what more my organization needs to do, I think it's always going to go back to inclusion by design, which means from the ground up, whether you're designing a process, you're innovating, you're creating a tool, you're developing software, you're creating a website, have that at the back of your mind that there will be persons with disabilities who are going to use this tool. And if that's already there at the beginning, then you don't have to fix it later on. And secondly, education and representation, as Ruel said, awareness, because we do need to have a voice, we need to speak up. We need to encourage people to speak up, particularly in government. And the laws in the Philippines, for example, are very archaic and they need to change. And we need a powerful voice of companies like Roel's, working with companies like mine and all the other companies that are passionate about inclusion and diversity to make the government listen to us, because the PWD community is just as valuable a segment of the community as any other segment there is.
That's great. Thank you for those words. Very important. And I think that lobbying function to change the law is just as important as what we do within our own organisations, obviously. I might just turn to the audience now and see if anyone has any questions. You can either put it in the Q&A or the chat box. We'd be very happy to take any questions that anyone has. While we're waiting to see if there's any questions, and hopefully there are, I might just ask Ruel for any final thoughts on this area and on International Day of People with Disability, particularly the theme around technological accessibility. Any final thoughts, Ruel?
Right. So maybe just encourage everyone in this call to be an ally. Learn more about the topic. Do not fear the topic, right? Talk about it, and more importantly, help do something about it, right? Because
be part of the change.
50% of the population, right? And all of us at some point, as we all age, might ourselves have a disability at some point. So this is not just about people with disability, but this is also about ourselves and how do we make the world more accessible, more inclusive, right? Because this is about humanity. So encourage everyone to really be allies for this this topic.
So we have one question that's come through. Leadership engagement is very important in many inclusion and diversity topics. What do you think organisational leaders and team leaders can do in their workplace to promote psychological safety and proper communication around disabilities? So we talked about individuals, but perhaps if we can come back to organisational leaders, anything specifically that you think that they could be doing? Michelle, do you want to pick this one up?
Well, from my personal experience as a leader with a disability, like I said, coming out with my disability and being willing to speak about it and meet with other persons with disability in the organization was very helpful. Because despite the fact that there shouldn't be, there is still some stigma around it. And sometimes the stigma comes from ourselves. Like, some people don't want to identify themselves as someone with a disability because they're afraid to be treated differently. So if you have the courage as a leader to say, hey, it's okay, I'm disabled and I'm okay, that would set the tone from the top, I think. And the tone from the top is always very important because people recognize sincerity and genuine, the genuine desire to be inclusive. Because like us disabled people, we don't want to be treated special. We just want to be treated the same. So don't treat me like you have to handle me with kid gloves because I'm disabled. I want you to joke around with me the same way as you would joke around with someone else. I just want to belong. And I think at the back of everyone's mind that's what we all want is a culture where it doesn't matter if you're disabled or not.
Everyone belongs. Yes, that's right. Yeah. Ruel, what do you think organizational leaders should be doing?
Well, one, they need to be advocating for this, right? For the topic of disability inclusion and enablement, meaning publicly advocating, especially those at the most senior levels, because that's very important to set the tone. Second, for frontline leaders, I think it's important, those who are actually supervise and manage, colleagues with disability, they need to get the proper training, awareness, and education on how to be a leader of someone with a disability, how to provide the necessary reasonable adjustments or accommodations to make sure that the person is able to perform at a relatively equal footing, with someone who might not identify as having a disability, right? So it's not a nice to have, right? It's a need, it's a necessity for leaders to really take ownership to make sure that the team or the organization is inclusive and accessible, right? So, I mean, that's a responsibility of those that are in position to, to influence someone or a team or an organization.
Sure. Great. Thank you for those thoughts. We don't seem to have any other questions, although we still have a few minutes left if anyone wants to ask one. So I might just come back to Misha now to provide some final thoughts about this topic and any takeaways you'd like our audience to have.
I think the only takeaway that I want people to go with as they leave the session today is empathy. Because if you have empathy, then you have the right mindset to create a change. So whether you're a leader or an ordinary individual, if you have the empathy, that will make you want to learn about disability. It will make you want to educate yourself about how you can help, what you can do, how you can be an advocate for change. And I answer to you the same thing I answer when they ask me, what do you think about International Women's Day? And I say, I actually dream of a day when we won't need an International Women's Day or an International Day of People with Disability, because we would have gotten to equal and it is no longer necessary. So to me, that's my dream. I think it may be very, very far off in the future, but I really feel hopeful that we're getting there.
Yes, so do I. Very important. And hopefully through events like this, we can build awareness and education and take a small step to achieving that goal. So look, thank you both so much for your contributions today and all your very thoughtful commentary on the topic. I've certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure that our audience has too. It was International Day for People with Disabilities last Saturday, but of course every day is a day for people with disabilities. And so I think, if I could say one thing to our audience is to, keep the conversation that happened on this event today in your mind and take it forward with you throughout the year. And obviously ask your colleagues questions, find out more information, become aware. And if you are a person with disability, please, as Misha said, have the courage to identify and also to educate your colleagues, because I think sometimes people may feel that they're not able to ask questions for fear of offending. So lots for everyone to do in both spaces, I guess. So I'll bring this event to a close. Thank you to everyone who's joined us today. And a special thank you to Mission and to Ruel. Really value your time and your contributions. Thank you also to Aki, our Global Inclusion and Diversity Council member who introduced today. And thank you to everyone for joining today. There is another panel event later on today, if you wish to stay up for that. And we'll also have other members from Shell and Accenture on that panel. So if the time zone does suit you, please feel free to join that one as well. Any questions that you come to you afterwards, we'd be very happy to put through to our panelists. But for the time being, I'll end the session and wish you all a very good rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.